Welcome to Echo No More, clear, credible, court-ready documentation in high-conflict parenting. No hype, no legal jargon, no drama. I'm Dr. James. If you're new here, I'm really glad you found this space. This podcast is for protective parents navigating high-conflict custody situations, especially when the other parent is manipulative, emotionally unsafe, or unpredictable. I'm not a lawyer, and this podcast isn't legal advice. What I am is a parent who has lived through this system, and someone whose attorneys over and over again told me the same thing. Your documentation is excellent. They told me it made their job easier. They told me it protected my credibility, and they told me it changed how my case was received. That's why I'm sharing this. Not to teach you how to fight, but how to document calmly, clearly, and in a way courts actually understand. This is parent to parent, calm, grounded, and focused on protecting your child without losing yourself. By the time parents reach this episode, they usually understand what to document. What they'll still be unsure about is how it should sound. And that makes sense, because most of us have never been taught to write for a legal audience. We've been taught to write to explain ourselves, to persuade, or to express emotion. Court-neutral writing is none of those things. Court-neutral writing doesn't sound cold. It doesn't sound robotic. And it definitely doesn't sound like legal jargon. What it sounds like is observational. It sounds like someone who's paying attention, not someone trying to convince. When my attorneys told me my documentation was excellent, they didn't mean it was perfectly worded. God, no. They meant it was easy to read without reaction. That's the goal. Court-neutral writing allows the reader to stay regulated while they read. And when the reader stays regulated, they're more likely to stay fair. Here's something many parents don't realize. Tone is not just about emotional words. Tone shows up in sentence length, urgency, repetition, framing, and how much meaning you assign to events. Two parents can document the same incident and sound completely different, even if both are telling the truth. One sounds reactive, usually the protective one. One sounds observational. Courts trust the observer. Court-neutral writing stays close to the surface of what happened. It avoids mind reading, predictions, motive, guessing, character judgments. Not because those things aren't real, but because they aren't necessary. One of the biggest shifts for me was learning that neutral does not mean minimizing. Neutral means letting facts do the work. For example, instead of explaining why something was inappropriate, neutral writing simply describes what happened and what followed. Instead of telling the reader how alarming something was, neutral writing lets frequency and pattern show that. And instead of proving how hard something was, neutral writing shows how often it happened and how it affected the child. Neutral writing is not about stripping emotion out of your experience. It's about moving emotion out of the record so it doesn't compete with credibility. Another mistake parents make is thinking neutral writing has to sound unnatural. It doesn't. It sounds like this. This occurred, this repeated, this resulted in the following. Simple, direct, grounded. You don't need fancy language, you don't need legal phrases, you don't need to sound detached, you just need to sound steady. One way to tell if your writing is neutral is to ask yourself this question. If someone who disagreed with me read this, would they still understand what happened? If the answer is yes, your writing is neutral. If the answer is no, if your meaning depends on agreement, then interpretation has crept in. Another important piece of court-neutral writing is knowing when to stop. Neutral writing does not explain itself into exhaustion. Once the event is documented, once the pattern is clear, once the outcome is noted, you stop. Over-explaining often signals anxiety, not clarity, and courts can feel that. I want to address something many parents worry about. What if neutral writing makes it seem like I don't care? It won't. Caring is shown through consistency, not intensity. Caring is shown through follow-through, not emphasis. Courts see care in ongoing documentation, child-focused framing, regulated tone over time, not in emotional language. Neutral writing also protects you emotionally. When you write neutrally, you don't relive the event as deeply. You're not arguing with the page, you're recording and moving on. That containment matters, especially if you're documenting for months or years. Court-neutral writing is not about being agreeable. It's about being credible without effort. And credibility is what allows documentation to speak, even when you're not in the room. This is why my attorneys trusted my records. They didn't need to reinterpret them. They didn't need to soften them. They could hand them over as is. That's the standard you're aiming for. Not perfection, but usability. Neutral writing doesn't erase your experience. It protects it. Before we close, I want to remind you of something important. You don't need to document everything. You don't need to be perfect. And you don't need to convince anyone with emotion. Calm documentation is power. If this episode helped you, you will find a full structured system in my guide, Clear, Credible, Court Ready. It's designed to support, not replace, your attorney. And if you want help turning everything you're documenting into something organized and usable, you can visit www.economocoaching.org to download my guide on how to create a clear, court-ready documentation binder. Take what helps, leave what doesn't, and most of all, take care of yourself. I'll see you next week.